I have a very special guest with me today, Wayne Miller, retired ATF agent and longtime specialist in arson. His book, Burn, Boston, Burn, details the chase and capture of a large gang of arsonists who lit over 250 fires in just 2 years in Massachusetts. He's not only going to bring us with him on the chase for these guys, but into the very unique world of what is known as sparks. These are hobbyists that are into fires and fighting fires. This incredible conspiracy involved sparks, but also professional firefighters and Boston police. Hey, Wayne, good to see you, man.
Hey, good afternoon, Kevin.
Thank you very much for being here. So feel free on getting started anywhere, but it's always good to start at the beginning, and we'll save for the end the incredible way that you guys managed to catch these guys.
Well, just briefly, I joined ATF almost straight out of college in 1976. And the first 4 years, I basically worked gun cases. One of the cases was a 46 M16 seizure in Walpole, Massachusetts. But I knew I wanted to do something more when ATF started getting serious about arson cases. So 1982, the Boston office was one of 4 chosen around the country to have an arson task force, where we joined together with the Boston Fire Department to try to solve the issues of buildings burning in and around greater Boston area. So March 1982 is when the group began, our group. At the same exact time, Kevin,
That's amazing.
a group of arsonists started setting buildings on fire in the city of Boston.
Is that just a random coincidence, or were both things possibly related to? I know you're going to get into later their motives and related to Proposition 2.5. Was that in any way connected to the reason that you guys started your team in March of 1982?
No, pure coincidence that they set their first building fire in February and we started the group in March. We didn't know about them. They didn't know about us. But cities were burning around the country from the 70s into the 80s. So the federal government decided to assist state and local authorities to resolve that issue. Fires can be very complex. Your local department might have one investigator. The city of Boston might have 10 on a shift. They might have several. But the varying degrees of expertise and having time to investigate and having money, manpower, and expertise is why the federal government decided to go all in. It's one of the few things the federal government, I think, has ever done totally right. They produced a group of investigators that ended up working with state and local people throughout the country and really made a big dent in the arson problem throughout the United States.
That's great. And it is really important too. And there is a role for the federal government because, like you've highlighted in your really good book, a lot of these guys that are involved in a local or a state agency are only there for a short amount of time and then they move on. So it's good to have that centrally located expertise and training that you guys were able to achieve.
Right. I've been fortunate. I mean, ATF, the way they did it was we had to have, in the first 2 years, a minimum of 100 fires during our training. And we had to have a certain amount of classroom and other training. So eventually I got 3,000 hours of training. That's a lot. Yeah. And I have personally, now I don't like to confess, especially to the world, but I have personally set 100 fires. That's training fires. I've been on the inside of the building with the equipment. I've watched the fire grow. We videotaped them. We computerized them. And we've worked with engineers and we've worked with all sorts of people on every aspect of fire investigation. And, I am happy to bring that to state and local people. And I do it through the book even. I do a lot of training classes around the country. And I use like 14 training points that come from the book.
So it's interesting too. So we're going to go into, and I never knew about this world of sparks and until listening to you speak and then learning more from your book. And I find that, really fascinating. Were you at all? No, you weren't. I'm sure you weren't a spark, but the fact that you would, and early in your career, were drawn into this particular job. Did you have an interest in fires growing up?
Not at all, Kevin. I'm not one of those people that use the magnifying glass to light things on fire. Never thought about it at all until the late portion of the 70s. And I found out I didn't want to do undercover work and chase guns forever. Just like even earlier, I didn't want to be a DEA agent and work on drug cases because I just thought it was a hole that was never going to be filled. So I thought the fire business was a unique niche that on any one case, not only do you have to figure out what happened at the fire scene, but then you got to interview owners, whether it's residential, if it's a business, you have owners, you have employees, disgruntled employees, fired employees, competition, you have lawyers, bankers, insurance people, eyewitnesses. So that's what drew me to it. Each one is a puzzle that you put together, and that's why I wanted to do fires. And ended up doing it for another 20 years with ATF and almost 18 years on the private side.
Is there somebody in your position now that's inherited the mantle, that's benefited from all your work and now kind of has that similar job? Or
Sure, there's actually the second generation, the one who followed me and now retired recently. ATF doesn't have an arson task force in Boston anymore because the arson situation has dramatically declined around the city. But they do have certified fire investigators. I was one of those. And we go into the scene itself and work with the state and locals and try to figure out where it started and how it started. And yes, there's definitely people all over the country that still do that with ATF. And their sole purpose is to work with state and local people.
Okay, so let's get into this case here. I know I can tell from the book that you spent a lot of time interviewing one of the main people convicted in this, which was Greg Beamus, right?
Yes, sir.
And so let's start with him, the path that he was on, his history.
Sure. Greg grew up northwest of Boston, and his mom was a spark. And again, a spark is very similar to a baseball fan or any other sports fan. In this case, the fire is the sport. And there's a lot of memorabilia. There's a lot of old stuff, helmets, fire trucks some guys purchase. And they like to go to fires, some of them, a lot of them, when they get the opportunity, take pictures, watch firefighting operations, and see how well they do against the battle with the fire. So Greg's mom was a spark. And she started taking him as a young kid to local fires, into the fire departments. And Greg got very interested in listening to Boston with all the fire calls. And let me tell you, that kid spent a lot of time memorizing all the fireboxes in Boston. Firebox is something that was on the side of the street, attached to a building or a pedestal or something like that, that you pull the box. And the box number would record where the fire is, if it's at the corner of A and B Street type of thing. So Greg memorized a lot of this. And he wanted to be a firefighter, particularly in the city of Boston. So when he was old enough to finally drive, he would come into the city to spark the fires, meaning chase fires.
Yeah.
And the Sparkies or the Sparks would meet at particular locations. In particular, one was a Howard Johnson's right across from Boston Fire Headquarters. And they drove very similar cars, whether it be black LTDs or Chevy Malibus, and they had a whip antenna, and they could listen to the fire calls come in, and then they would respond immediately. And that's what Greg was doing.
I'm really interested about his mother, just not to linger on it too long, but I mean, that seems, especially in that day and age, kind of strange for a woman to be. Why, do you have any insight as to why she was into it and was following around fires and towing her kid along? And
no, it's just something she had an interest in, and Greg was very close to his mother.
Yeah.
Sadly, she passed away from cancer when he was only 16 years old. and Greg's father a year later moved up to Maine and got remarried up there. So Greg was left behind with one of his best friends, Lenny Kendall, who also came from the area, who also grew up with a keen interest in fires and firefighting. So the two of them spent a lot of time, and they joined the local volunteer department out there as soon as they could, I think at 16. But their goal in life was work in the big city. And they met a lot of like-minded people when they came into the city who also were sparks. And a lot of those people would like to be firefighters.
Did they meet these guys? Now, I know you mentioned in the book there either were or are two old Sparks clubs in the city. Did they meet these guys? That's okay. You can pause. Did they meet these guys? Did they meet the fellow Sparks in the clubs, or if they didn't have access to the clubs yet, were they just seeing them out in the field? Like you go to a fire and you see a bunch of other guys out there.
Good question. Good question. They definitely met them in the field. The Boston Sparks Association is one of the oldest clubs in the country. Arthur Fiedler, the famous maestro conductor, he was a member of the Boston Sparks. It goes back over 100 years. And they hadn't joined or tried to join it at this point in time. Two of the guys that Greg did meet were members of the Sparks Association. And I don't even think Greg actually tried to become a member. But he hung out with Boston firefighters. They went to certain firehouses. They latch on to certain people that they really like and firehouses, and they'd have dinner with the guys. Mm-hmm. And so just in the parking lot, you get your own clique of friends who were Sparks. You'd know a lot of them, be friendly with a lot of them, but you had your core group.
Which actually leads right into my next question, which was going to be, how do the professional firefighters feel about these guys? But it sounds like most of them were pretty receptive to it. They didn't have a problem with it or consider it odd or anything.
Well, it went both ways. Some of them thought they were a pain in the neck sometimes, hanging out at the fire scenes and asking questions and stuff like that. But other ones, just became friends with them and knew that a lot of them wanted to be firefighters, but didn't have the opportunity yet to become one.
There was an interesting part of your book where Greg tells you about before they began their arson spree, and maybe even actually not long before, but where there were two incidents where he was at a fire as a spark and actually got called on to help.
Yes, and that directly relates to the motivation for setting the fires. Proposition 2.5 here in Massachusetts got voted in on November 4th, 1980, the same day Ronald Reagan got elected president and Greg Beamus turned 20 years old. Proposition 2.5, very simply, folks, is if you have a $100,000 piece of property, it can only be taxed at $2,500 or 2.5%. So when that happened, Massachusetts was full of cities that were poor cities. It's not like that today. Property values are so high in Massachusetts. But because, let's say, a three-family, we had lots of three families in Boston. We still do. A three-family usually are 3 floors up. And that might have only been valued at $20,000 back in 1980. So if it's only $20,000, you're not getting a lot of tax dollars. And the cities and towns all over Massachusetts were worried about how they were going to pay for the civil servants' salaries. So who's the typical suspects in that? It's the teachers, the police, and firefighters.
Yeah.
So for instance, Boston lost 600 firefighters in 2 years out of 1,700, well over a third. 22 fire companies closed. So the story you mentioned was shortly after these firehouses started closing. And one of those fires was less than a block and a half away from the firehouse, but that fire company was closed down. So 2 individuals died in that fire. And Greg actually jumped in to help the actual firefighters to raise the ladders or take the bodies out. And he actually assisted on CPR for some of the victims. And shortly thereafter, he went to another one with 2 young boys that died in the fire. And this greatly affected him. I mean, I think Greg is in a lot of ways fairly sensitive anyway. And then his mother dying so young, I think a lot of this really caused Greg to go off the deep end in a sense.
Yeah. So what happened next after that formative experience?
So the group often talked about Prop 2.5. And when it went into effect, they all started thinking what can be done to reverse it. So first these guys went out in probably late 81 and started throwing bricks at car windows. They broke maybe even 50 to 100 a night. And their idea with that was to get the police to be tied up writing reports for this petty crimes instead of being involved with more serious stuff. So their idea was to try to get the people to scream and get the press involved and make a big deal about it in the media. So that didn't cause any stir. So they went to a pellet gun and popped a whole bunch more windows. That didn't cause anything. So one of the members, Donald Stackpole, said, the only thing that's going to change this potentially is setting fires. And they had a lot of discussion about it. First, they just set dumpsters on fire. For those people who are in the Boston area and know where the Charles River is, on the Boston side, there's a fairly expensive area with a lot of brownstones, and behind each one is a dumpster. So they went down this alleyway and placed a simple device in each dumpster, and one went off right after another. And there's 20 or 30 in the night. And these guys would go across the Charles River onto the Cambridge side and just watch and laugh when they heard the radio calls coming in, because Boston firefighters had to be called from outside the Back Bay area where this occurred. They didn't know what address, where it was. They didn't know where they were once they got to a fire, what address. So there was a lot of confusion on the radio, and these guys loved it. But it didn't get the attention of the media. So they decided to set buildings on fire.
It's an amazing, so you're watching this evolution. You go from breaking windows, which is not really unlikely. That's unlikely to hurt anybody, to setting dumpster fires, which is still unlikely to hurt anybody. And now you're picking out buildings. And I think that they chose abandoned buildings, right? But there's still, now you're putting the lives at risk of the firefighters that are going to come in, and you never know if there's going to be somebody inside an abandoned building. And
yes, the discussion was, let's do the abandoned buildings. And there were so many of them in Boston back in that day and they started with the residential 2 and 3 family homes that were just vacant. And, figuring, and it's unlikely, but there could be a homeless person. We didn't have the same situation back then with a lot of homeless people would stay in these type of buildings. But they said, okay, most of the time firefighters don't have to go inside, don't have to fight these fires inside, and they're less likely to get hurt. But, an accident could happen on the street. You can slip on the ice. There's so many ways that people can get hurt. And just to let the people know, eventually, during their fire spree, over 200 firefighters were injured.
Just from the fires that they set.
Yes.
But they obviously, that didn't bother them, or not enough to make them stop anyways.
Not at all. I mean, the most poignant story is October 2nd, 1982. They set a fire in South Boston, an old military barracks. And when they set that fire, these guys were crazy. I'll just give you this part. They were so crazy that they called in a bomb scare at Mass General that night, because the bomb squad's headquarters were right next to the building they wanted to burn. As soon as they saw the bomb squad take off to Mass General Hospital, they went in and set their fire. And that fire eventually went to multiple alarms with firefighters on the roof trying to cut holes, etc. 22 firefighters got seriously hurt, falling through the roof, breaking their backs, breaking legs, getting burned. And that was the most serious. But 4 days later, they set another commercial building on fire where it could have happened again.
So what does Greg say about that? Was there any and was there any debate amongst them after that to be more careful or to stop it or?
Yeah. By that point in October, I remember the first fire being back in February. They had set about 100 buildings on fire, and some firefighters did get hurt. Most of them, they would say to themselves, they're not serious injuries. But when that one occurred, they actually met the next day at Ray Norton's house, and he was a full-time Boston firefighter himself. And the discussion was, we have to be more careful. It shouldn't go like this. But Donald Stackpole said, it was their own fault. They shouldn't be on the roof. Donald was one of the meanest guys, and he could never be a firefighter, not like some of the other guys who wanted to be. And so they said, we have to be more careful. But I don't know, they forgot real soon because they set many buildings after that, another 200 almost after that.
At that point, they were just addicted to everything about what they were doing with it.
You hit it right on the nose. They went from that Boston Tea Party motive, if we do something, something's going to change. And they did keep that as a motive, but the sub-motives became the addiction, nightly entertainment, and let's screw with the investigators. They knew that Boston and ATF and the state fire marshals, they knew we were out there on certain nights of the week, and they just changed tactics just to screw with us. And they laughed about that and had a jolly old time.
Well, we're going to come back to that show because that's a really probably the most compelling part of the story, the chase. But I just had one more question. So I'm always curious with situations like this, when people form a conspiracy for something like this, where it's going to be an ongoing activity. Do they ever ask themselves, what's the end game? Like, is there an end to it? Do they ever even think like, how do you see, like, do you ever think there's a point where they're going to stop setting fires? I mean, at some point you would think they would say, geez, the only way this ends is sooner or later we end up in jail.
Well, that's the way it did happen, because their end goal was to get so much pressure from the media and from the people from Boston and other towns where they set fires that they wanted the mayor in Boston at that time was Kevin White. Mm-hmm. He was a iconic figure here, and they felt he was playing with police and fire as pawns. So if they could get enough pressure on him, then they would rehire those guys who were laid off and reopen the firehouse. That would have been their goal. They had minor victories along the way, like a firehouse in East Boston got reopened and one in Hyde Park got reopened, partially because of their efforts.
So, but they did, but there's no, I mean, that they wouldn't have stopped, even if Prop 2.5 was reversed and everything was reopened. At that point, they weren't going to stop. But I guess maybe they didn't understand that themselves at that time.
Again, at that point, because it became such an addiction.
Yeah.
And that entertainment factor for them to go chase fires that they had set after, they're just like any other spark out there on the street. Let's go chase the fire that we just set. And let's watch everybody's faces as they're enjoying the fire, and let's watch the firefighters put their efforts into it. And maybe it never would have stopped. As a matter of fact, I'm going to ask Greg that, because I'm still in touch with Greg Beamus.
All right, so let's get to the chase. How did it begin when you first were brought on to this task force to try to find these guys? When and where did that begin?
Well, of the first 100 fires, which from February until about October, the first 100 fires were almost all within the city of Boston. So by the end of March, April, May, we knew that there was this dramatic uptick of set fires. So Boston in particular was doing the origin and cause, go into the building, try to figure out where and how it started. And being so many abandoned buildings that didn't have electricity or heat or cooking, most of the time they could determine that this was intentionally set. So Boston was running around like crazy, and ATF joined with them, not to do some of the scenes in the beginning, but to conduct the interviews and try to figure out who's doing this. At any one time, once we figured out that this wasn't just a building owner, because a lot of the buildings didn't even have insurance and were owned by the city of Boston, etc. So we would just run around having a list of maybe 18 people as potential suspects, and then we'd get 2 people off the list, and next day add 2 more people to the list.
How did you get the original list?
Just past people who may be arrested from being arsonists, that type of thing.
Yeah.
But yet, we kind of figured that this couldn't be one person.
Right.
And at one point, sadly, we had to, think maybe the union was involved. That those cases are very hard to work on. How about any one of the 600 firefighters? Could they have joined together, the ones who were laid off? That type of thing. And could it be other people just trying to make a point, which in a sense it was. So this just went on and on. We were running around like chickens with our heads cut off. And we were getting nowhere fast until November 1982.
It's one of the things that occurred to me as I was reading the book too was, of course, hindsight is 20/20, but knowing of the existence of these clubs and these sparks and the way these guys are just become familiar to the professionals, seeing these guys just sitting out there watching the fires and going, was there a part of you guys that said, all right, this has to be someone that's obsessed with fires? So we start looking into these groups?
We did. I interviewed the president of the Boston Sparks, and I interviewed a couple other people that were longtime members of the Sparks. And as a matter of fact, in the many years following, the decades following, the guys would say, I remember that. I think you guys were following me back then. That type of but there's so many of them. I mean, they have quite a membership and a lot of people who aren't. So at any one fire, you could have 20 or 30 fire buffs out there, sparks, and just because they're there doesn't make them an arsonist. So,
right.
There's only so much you can do. You can talk to people, but if they don't have inside information, and if they're not willing to give you that information, you're not going to get very far. And that's what was happening.
Yeah, I could see where it was tough because of what was going on. You had the unions, you had the laid off firefighters, and then you had the sparks as 3 possible groups, and they're all connected. Some of those there's interconnections between those two, but that's a pretty sizable number of people to be looking at.
On top of that, Kevin, you had board up companies. Could they be making a profit in the city of Boston? Because these board up companies, only maybe 2 or 3 major ones. Let's set a bunch of fires, and then we get called up to do these board ups at multi-hundreds of dollars each time. There was one individual, Elliot Bellin, that I mentioned in the book. Elliot had since passed away, but he was a friend later on. But Elliot was like the godfather of the Boston Sparks. He knew so much. He assisted for free. For many years, he had access to Boston Fire Headquarters and assisted. And he finally got a paid job after helping them for 20 years. But Elliot was a guy, he looked like a little mole. He's a guy perfectly spent his nights out chasing fires, and he'd sleep during the day type of thing. But he had so much background information, and we interviewed him, but yet he didn't have any direct knowledge of anybody setting fires.
That's interesting because you're not only going down a lot of these people that are innocent and interviewing them, but some of them are real characters like that too. So
I can remember Elliot's vocabulary was beyond most of us, and he would just throw these words out all of a sudden, and I'd be scratching my head talking to him. And he was a unique individual, unlike any that Boston will ever see again.
So did it start to get, when they started expanding beyond Boston? Because I remember seeing in your lecture that they went further out. So did that kind of eliminate some of the possibilities that you guys were looking at?
They were doing these Friday morning, they call them Friday night firebugs, and they were setting multiple fires. And in June, so about 4 months into the spree, one night they set 9 of the 10 multiple alarm fires in the city of Boston, the busiest night in Boston fire history. They were going all over the place. Now, they knew that during the summer of 82 that we started doing surveillances like in Southie because there were multiple fires, big fires in Southie. So they went to Quincy one night, set 2 fires, raced through the city, and set 2 up on the North Shore in towns of Everett, Chelsea area. And once they knew that we were concentrating certain nights in Boston, they went to Lawrence and Lowell. They went to Canton, Massachusetts twice, about a month apart. They hit Cambridge a few times. Then they went out to Fitchburg. I think it was October or November of 82. Fitchburg is about 40 miles northwest of Boston. Nobody goes out there to spark fires. There's very rarely a decent fire to go to in Fitchburg, which is an old mill town type of thing. You can run down a lot of ways. That one night they went out there, they set 4 major multiple alarm fires that, just an old 3-decker, an old mill building, flames coming out of every floor all at once. So they were doing that to throw us off, mess with us, but it didn't give us any new leads, except when they started calling. It's another crazy thing they did. Some of these places, like either Lowell or Lawrence and then Fitchburg, they'd call the business line of the fire department thinking it's not recorded and say something like, "Aren't you glad the Boston arsonist in town? Pull your bootstraps up. Here comes one," something like that. Because they were domestic terrorists, Kevin. They were holding the city and surrounding counties hostage, in a sense. You might be getting to it, but I'll mention it now. This letter that was sent in, I think, August of 1982. This letter was put together by Greg Beamus, but with the backing from his group. They knew what the letter said, and he did it old Hollywood style. He cut out letters from magazines, newspapers, and pasted them on a page. And it said something like, "I am the Boston Friday Night Firebug," and Mr. Flair was another nickname that came out. "And I am going to continue burning these buildings until firefighters are rehired and the fire companies are opened. And if these abandoned buildings are torn down, we will we will set fire to occupied buildings." It's a threat letter. It is terrorist.
That's definitely, yeah, you're threatening people's lives. Yep.
Right. So they went really far with this conspiracy, and they held it together for a long time. Nearly 2 years they held this conspiracy together.
So at the height of this, when you guys, you knew they were doing it on Friday nights, were you guys out at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning trying to spot anything suspicious?
Oh, yes, we were. At one point, we were, again, back in Southie. We had agents on top of some of the commercial buildings, like warehouses, with binoculars and radios. And we had mobile units out in the street. And we would tell them, somebody's coming down L Street right now. It's the middle of the night in some of these areas. Well, we couldn't see L Street, but we could see A, B, C, D streets. And, it's being industrial, there's not that many cars in the middle of the night, but it's a cut through also. So there was a lot of stop and frisk, in a sense. Stop and identify is what it was. And funny thing about it, every night we were out there were no fires in the area.
So they knew that must have been a little bit of a clue too, or at least that they were watching you guys or knew what to look for, that you were out there.
Well, with Ray Norton working in fire headquarters, he had gotten injured. So he was on what they call a lighthouse duty, and he was cleaning fire headquarters at night. And that's when the Boston Arson Squad would gather the troops, and we would join with them and head out. So Ray only had to look out the window and say, "There's 10 cars out there tonight. Guys, be careful around the city." So they'd head out and set fires elsewhere.
So on the group was you guys, how many ATF agents, and then the Austin Squad? Did that involve Boston cops, state troopers, plus the fire department?
Yep. And initially, it was multiple ATF agents, Boston Fire, which had about 8 or 10 guys out there with us. And then the Boston police put several out there with us too. And eventually we got the fire marshals more involved because they did not work. It was an agreement with the city in Boston. They didn't work fires in the city. So when they started moving outside the city, then the fire marshals got involved also. So, but the surveillance is, I guess, again, Ray probably clued them in and they figured it out. They're in the business. You had Robert Grabluski was a Boston police officer, full-time police officer. He was one of the arsonists. Greg became a cop in the city, but he knew the fire operations inside and out. Wayne Sandin was a lieutenant police officer with Boston Housing Authority. He knew the streets all over the place. They'd pick out targets during the day when they're out there during the day. And then they'd stay awake almost every night. I don't know how they did it, how they spent any time with their family or loved ones or whatever.
Were any of these guys married or had kids or?
The only one married, Stackpole had a wife, and they had a ward of the state they were taking care of. And Wayne Sandin was married with 2 young children. And he had a girlfriend on the side too. So again, with everything else going on, I don't know how he juggled everything.
Yeah, that's when you're young, I guess. So what came next in the sequence on the hunt?
Well, again, by the time November came around, we still weren't any closer to making an arrest. But November 21, 1982, Garrity Lumber had a large fire. I mean, flames were well over 100 feet above the building, which was already about 3 stories tall. It was Garrity number 2 because 1 month earlier they had set another portion of Garrity Lumberyard on fire. So that particular night, a friend of mine, Nat Whittemore, who was a member of the Boston Sparks, but he was also a WBZ cameraman. So his assignment was to run to these fires every night. So he was on the street just waiting for them, just like any other spark would be. But one of his best buddies was an arson investigator and a photographer from Cambridge. That was Ed Fowler. And they responded to that Garrity lumber fire. They saw something in the tracks on the grass that bothered them. So these tracks are underneath the fire hoses, which means they were here before the fire trucks laid their hose lines. So there's a good chance the arsonists are here. Well,
that's a good observation.
That's right. So they split up. And when Nat came around a lumber pile, he could hear this boisterous roar of people. With all the noises going on in the fire scene, he could still hear these people. And he picked up his camera and looked at this group of guys on a lumber pile and around a lumber pile who were yelling and whooping and having a grand old time. And just as he was ready to pull his camera and aim at him, a Boston cop, Grabluski, was off duty. He had an army jacket on. He had a shoulder holster on. He reached across, pulled out his handgun, and waved it in the air for about 2 or 3 seconds, like it was on a bucking bronco. Nat caught that on film, and they recognized right away that he was shooting his camera at them. So they said, "You better put it away." And he did, and they laughed about it and hid their faces a little bit, and they looked off to the side, off camera, because Ray Norton, the Boston firefighter, was also there. There were 5 of them total. Besides Grabluski and Norton, Stackpole, Beamus, and Joe Gorman. 5 members of this conspiracy were there. Does that make them arsonists? Just because they're rooting for the home team?
Just make some good suspects.
Yeah, who's the home team? The fire's the home team.
Right.
Instead of rooting for the firefighters, they're rooting for the home team, the fire. So, yeah, with that, a couple days later, my partner Billy Murphy and I knocked down Grabluski's door. We figured he's a cop. Maybe if he has.
How did you find out who he was? Did you were able somebody identified him from the photo or?
Yeah, we got invited to WBZ. Boston Fire and Police and ATF got invited to WBZ the next day. They didn't put this on TV, but we watched the footage, and a couple people were identified. Grabluski, Norton, even so he wasn't on video. Stackpole, that's the only one who identified right away. Being a cop, figuring cop to cop, we went to Grabluski first and knocked on his apartment door. And he invited us in, sat down, talking just like you and I are doing right now. And he apparently lied straight to our faces. He wasn't nervous or anything. So we're about to leave when Billy gets up and puts on his trench coat, the same one he wore every single day, and just walked a couple steps over from the couch we were sitting on and said, "My grandfather used to make bird cages or lamps out of these things." He's pointing at one of the fireboxes. Now, the importance of the firebox. If you're in any of these neighborhoods, residential particular, Roxbury, Dorchester, Jamaica Plain, etc., in the middle of the night, the fastest way to report a fire was a firebox on the corner. Back then, a lot of them opened the door and you could talk to fire alarm and say, "I'm at the corner of such and such, and there's a fire in the house here." But even if you didn't, just pulling it would relay to Boston Fire that there's a fire at that location. Mm-hmm. So Greg and all the other guys knew this. So by stealing some of these fireboxes and pulling them off the street, that would cause a delay in reporting the fire.
They started stealing these things.
Well, there were 14 of them missing that year. And any one year, there's usually no more than one and maybe two missing. Mm. There were 14 of them. So Billy saw the number. Each one has a number right on the front, easy to see. That box number was 1712. Billy and I went back to the office, which we were in Weymouth already. Billy lived down real close to Weymouth. I lived on the South Shore. We didn't need to be going back to Boston at 8:30 at night, away from our homes. But the excitement of identifying that as one of the stolen boxes. Billy had a list underneath the blotter on his desk. And I love to tell this to the crowd on a mimeographed sheet, because anybody under the age of 30 probably doesn't know what a mimeograph
right.
Maybe 40 or 50.
Probably.
So that was the first box they stole, box 1712 from Roxbury. So Bobby had it in his apartment. So what's that do for us? It doesn't make him an arsonist still. He's a fire buff. He wanted to be a Boston firefighter. He told us that. He said, even though I'm a cop, I still want to be a Boston firefighter. So what it did was we went to Boston and we got a local warrant, search warrant for that. We went back the next day, knocked on the door. Nobody's there, but the building management let us in. And guess what? The firebox was still sitting there on the floor. As I, again, like to tell the crowd, we get no respect. I mean, this guy should have been a little nervous that we're asking questions, and he's out there setting over 100 fires by that point, that he probably should have hit it somewhere.
And there must have been a fire set near where that box had been in Roxbury, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, exactly. The way it goes is you set a fire at the corner of A and B, and you steal the box at B and C. So that delays reporting to that fire, and the firehouse is closed at C and D. So now you have a major delay. So a lot of these fires were fully involved buildings by the time the fire department got there because of these delays that they created. So with that firebox, we went back. It was sitting there. We went back with Boston PD and Weymouth PD, and Boston was not happy. The detectives did not want to be there. They were disgruntled. You're going after one of our guys. Yeah. He told us he got it at a flea market, and we believe him, they said. So as soon as we found the firebox, they wanted to get out of there. We didn't. We tried to look for other items relating to fires because that's what the warrant said we could look for. But with that, again, does that make him an arsonist? He was charged with receiving stolen property. And Boston police took him off the street, took his gun away, and put him up in the turret, which is the dispatch area, Boston police. So they were going to conduct their internal affairs investigation, which went on and on and on for the next 13 months. They still hadn't finished. I don't know what took so long.
They weren't looking.
Something like that. So what happened after that is Grabowski came in and took a polygraph exam with an attorney. I don't know what his game was because he flunked it badly.
Wow. That's,
you know.
Yeah. What could you possibly, I guess, was he trying to get back on the street with the cops, or what was he?
Maybe, he figured he was just better than the machine.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
It gives us another chance to interview a person.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
why did you have a problem with these questions? That type of thing. And sometimes you get confessions. Other times people just say, get out of here. I'm heading out of here. I'm going home. Well, his attorney said to us, he can't talk. And I said, what the F do you mean he can't talk? What does that mean? Is he going to get killed or lose his job? What does it mean? It sounds pretty important to me. So we didn't get to talk to him again. That was the first week of December 1982. We didn't get to talk to him until January 1984, 13 months later. That's a
Did
long
the fires slow down at all in this time when they knew that you guys were getting warm?
Another good question. Yes. After Christmas time, 1983, the fires, they had set by that point probably 150 fires and probably got down to another 80 in 1983. Much slower, though.
Yeah.
Spread out. And that's when they went to some of these other cities like Lawrence and Lowell, too. But
and when you talked to Greg after, was there internal discussions about, boy, they're getting on to us? Were there arguments within the ranks saying we need to slow down? Or
they were in a conundrum. They said exactly what you just said. Maybe we have to be more careful. We have to slow down. We have to keep looking in the mirror and see who's behind us, that type of thing. But on the other hand, they said, if we stop setting these fires, then they're going to really believe it was us. So they had to set more fires just so we would start to believe it has to be somebody else. Otherwise, they would have stopped, So,
unbelievable.
Now, think about it again. Okay, we got Grabowski as a potential suspect. How are you going to follow him in the middle of the night, driving through areas of Roxbury, Dorchester on these desolate, a lot of houses, but vacant buildings, desolate roads in the middle of the night? The equipment we had back then was not very good. We'd have portable radios. We could talk to multiple crews, but he would spot a tail within moments in the middle of the night. You can't drive with your lights off all the time on these streets.
Right.
And, you could be out there many, many nights with a lot of manpower and a lot of money expended and come up with absolutely nothing. So we didn't know in the beginning if he was strong enough as a suspect first. But one of the other easier investigative techniques is go out and interview people. So we knocked on the door of Ray Norton. Oh my God, what an interview I had with him the first time. He's yelling and screaming at me and get out of here, just because I hang out with these guys, you're coming after me, that type of thing. And shortly thereafter, he called our office to apologize and wanted to talk to me again, but didn't offer anything. But we knocked on the door of Wayne Sandin, a young cop, again, now married with 2 kids. I was married with 2 kids. I was only 30 years old. He was only about 28 to 30 years old. A lot in common. So Wayne, do you know anything? Can you help? He said, no, but I'm willing to help you in any way I can. And he did tell us that they burned a strip car in South Boston, something where tires are gone, the radios are gone, stuff like that. That didn't do too much for me. Maybe Boston could have arrested him for that, but you needed the direct information, and you needed more than Wayne wasn't going to testify at that point, you know. So I got tidbits from him all through 1983, and we actually put a wire on him one night.
Oh wow! Were you guys able to do that yourselves, or did you have to bring in like the FBI or something to help with that?
Nope, we wired people up, and we wore wires regularly doing undercover work.
Okay.
We put both a transmitter on him and a recorder. So if one failed, or if the transmission wasn't good, which in the city a lot of times it wasn't good, but the recorder should pick it all up. Well, guess what? Neither one worked that night. They picked up when he's walking into the trailer in South Boston. That was Donald Stackpole's security company headquarters, in a sense, his trailer.
Yeah.
And as soon as he walked in, and everything seemed to die. No conversation. So it kept going on and off like that during the night. Our tech guy said, I think he's fooling around with it. Well, he's sort of my source of information. You can't call him an informant. A police officer can't be a legitimate informant. It can only be a source of information. Mm. So, but he's my source. So I didn't want to believe that he was intentionally doing something. But after a while, I started believing it more and more. But he cast his line out by saying, I'll give you anything I have. He said, oh, they set a car on fire that caught onto a building. Well, that's a little better, you know, something might be able to get. But then again, I need more corroborating information. Yeah. Then he said, well, Donald Stackpole is going to burn some of his security cars because they get high miles and they're not worth anything, but sell them to the insurance company and you get a little more money. We waited for that and waited for that. Didn't happen. And then all of a sudden, August of 1983, Wayne said, you know something that they did? They stole a brand new unmarked cruiser. Now, these guys are really crazy, right? A brand new unmarked cruiser from Natick Ford, west of Boston. And they stripped parts of it for their own personal cruisers. Like Grabowski drove a LTD, and that's what they stole, was an LTD. They took the grill and headlights and some other parts, and then they took it and dumped it in the ocean or in the water, in a channel. It's ocean water, but it's not quite the ocean. It's called the Fort Point Channel around here, for those who know it. It's the body of water divides downtown Boston from South Boston. Mm-hmm. And they dumped it in there. But he told us about this. We got the Boston dive teams, the police and fire, and we recovered that vehicle. And
so he was giving you accurate information. He just was on the fence, I guess, at that point.
Yeah, I never got what he was doing. I never found out from Wayne why he was giving me this stuff, but not telling me everything. So we did. He was accurate with that. We got that. But we didn't do anything. It doesn't make him an arsonist yet. It makes him a thief.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. So by December of 1982, we had a new supervisor, an agent who grew up in Boston but had moved around and became a supervisor up in Maine, I think, and then went to headquarters in D.C., and then came back to Boston to be the arson task force supervisor, with the blessing of the director, who said, you're going back to Boston, but you're going to solve this or else, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So Phil Tortorella was the supervisor, the new supervisor. And he said, I'm going to review all your cases here in this office. And when he got to mine, he said, Wayne, you have to focus. Stop running to fires. Stop running around. You're on the right track. He said, I know you are. So get Grabowski again and let's put the pressure on him. Mm-hmm. So finally, on the night of January 12, 1984, Grabowski was working up in the turret at Boston Police Headquarters. Deputy Superintendent Jack Gifford had him pulled down to an office on the second floor. We had two other detectives there and Senior Special Agent Jimmy Karolidis. We talked to Bobby. We want to know about fires. We say, he's still denying it. We had it all planned. We put him at the far end of the room, away from the door. He wasn't under arrest. You're free to go. We weren't interviewing him about the stolen firebox, so we didn't have to have an attorney present for him. We wanted to talk about fires. And Jimmy Carolides was the one who did most of the talking. Jimmy was an actor. Jimmy was a card-carrying thespian who did plays and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, he should have gotten an Academy Award for what he did that night. He's walking around with his three-piece suit on, and he's berating Bobby. You know, you swore to uphold and protect the people, the citizens of Boston, and look at you now. But then he had a final line. His final line was, there are 6 people in this room with badges, and only 5 deserve them. Bobby dropped his head.
Wow.
Chin to his chest. We waited. Don't say anything. Don't spoil it. He lifted his head up and said, what do you want to know?
Wow. That's like a Hollywood moment.
Oh, my God. I'll tell you, this is the dramatic rights for the book have been purchased with the goal of making an 8-part series. And that is definitely one of the dramatic moments during the show.
Yeah.
The description, the room, the way Jimmy was dressed, the way he looked, everything I have down in detail. And within the next hour, Bobby spit out about 29 fires they set. And he named,
so, you know, and for all his flaws, just the only way you ultimately were able to get him is he did have some kind of a conscience or some part of a self-identity that he didn't want to see himself as one of the bad guys that didn't deserve his badge.
You know, the weight was on his shoulders. The world was closing in on him. And maybe a coward. I'm going to save myself and give up these other guys. You know, people talk about being rats all the time. Well, I tell you, without people willing to give us information in this world, he'll at a loss for solving a lot of crimes. So, you know, you try to build up and get the pressure on people so they will confess. And so we got Bobby away from Boston PD after about an hour. My head was spinning. I had a headache. My stomach was churning. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You know, this is the second major case in 4 years. After the 46 machine gun case, I have now this case falling in my lap. And he only named at that point 3 or 4 guys involved.
Yeah.
But we got him back to our office, read him his rights again. We read him his rights right after he started confessing, read him his rights again. We put it on tape, and he started confessing, just sitting across from us, just a couple guys conversing about fires. And in the middle of the night, we called the U.S. Attorney's office to have one of them come to our office. You know, we wanted to make sure we're doing everything right. We had a discussion with the guy who came. A very familiar name to probably a lot of your listeners. He was the second assistant U.S. attorney here in Boston at the time, Robert Mueller. He went on to all sorts of fame and infamy, depending on points of view.
Yeah, maybe a bit of both, rightly so, right? So,
yeah. So he said, you have to arrest him because there's a lot of things that could happen. He could go out and set another fire. He could kill himself. He could tell his Confederates about us closing in on him. We don't know what's going to happen. So at about 3:24 or so in the early morning hours, I had the pleasure of placing Robert Gablowski under arrest. It was now January 13th, Friday the 13th. A very unlucky day for Bobby, and a lucky day for the citizens of Boston and elsewhere. So he went to sleep that night. We housed him in the Holiday Inn near Government Center, and he fell asleep. The weight of the world had been lifted, and he just was exhausted. The adrenaline rush of confessing. He went to sleep. But the next day, he had an attorney in federal court, and we couldn't talk to him again. for 5 months. They
Did you
tried
make
to
any arrests immediately after that, or?
not at all. We worked our tails off. We now had about 10 people working every single day, probably 10 to 12 hours per day, corroborating what he told us to firm up the case against him. What if the confession got thrown out? And that's what that's what they tried to do. We had to corroborate and firm up the case and start gathering information against his fellow arsonists.
Did the fires stop once he was taken off, or?
No.
Wow.
No. Once he got out on bail, he lied to his buddies just as well as he lied to us the first time.
Oh, so he didn't disappear. He just was maybe gone as far as they were concerned. He was gone for a day or two, right? And then he was right back with them.
You know, these guys gave the feds way too much credit. They said that we had these articles in the newspaper and on TV about this cop who got arrested for arson. He said that was all made up. Bobby said, yeah, the feds talked to me, but, you know, initially he said, but they didn't arrest me. He said, I didn't say anything. So he just kept lying to him and they believed it.
Oh.
But he didn't set any more fires.
Right.
But some of the other guys did. And that Wayne Sandin, who was giving me that information, he was out there very active. Eventually, he set about 50 with other people. He set about 50 fires.
But he had to have known you guys were hot on that trail.
Yeah, I mean, he trusted Bobby enough that when we wired Bobby, well, in May, the judge accepted the confession, threw out his motion to dismiss. Mm. We wired Bobby up 17 times, phone calls, half of those, and live meetings. And he met people like Greg Beamus, Donald Stackpole, and Wayne Sandin live while he's wired. And they talked. Stackpole never talked freely. Yeah. He was more shrewd. Yeah. But Beamus was just talking away. And Sandin, he said enough on tape that got him locked up eventually with no bail because he was a threat to several people, including the supervisor of ATF. He said on tape that he said, that bastard, he said, I'm going to go to my wife's uncle and have him take him out. I don't know. I guess the uncle was involved with the mob or something. I don't know. Yeah. But so because of just that statement, and he also said that he would take off to someplace like Australia, you know, not just Canada.
Flight risk, yeah.
So it got him locked up once he got locked up. Mm-hmm. So from that time, from May until July, we built the rest of our case. And there's a lot to do. And we had grand jury. We had some of them come in grand jury. Ray Norton lied in front of grand jury. Joe Gorman was going to lie, but he changed his mind and told the truth. So he rolled over before the arrests were made. And another kid, Mark Svenby, he rolled over eventually. He was a late comer.
Around this time, the fires must have stopped, though, right? Once you started
let's
pulling
see.
These guys in, or
I think it was May was the last fire.
Yeah. Who's at that one?
Mark Svenby was with Greg, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when Bobby finally went back to court and his motion was denied, and he told the guys, I'm just going to go to prison. I'm just going to go. And you guys don't worry about anything. I'm not going to tell them anything. They can, you know, just do whatever they have to do on their own. So he still convinced them.
Oh.
And Stackpole got a buddy of his that used to live across the street when he was growing up, but moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. This kid, Chris Damon. He called Chris out in Cincinnati and said, Chris, can you do me a favor? Bobby says he's going to go to prison, but maybe I can get him to go out and live with you and you can get him a job out there. And hem and haw, Chris said, yeah, I'll do it. So Chris joined a conspiracy. He wasn't an arsonist. but he joined the conspiracy. And he ended up going to prison for it too.
Unbelievable.
So that was all on tape eventually. Grabowski actually called him up and said, "Hey, Chris, I understand that you're ready for me in a few days." And right up until the day before Bobby was going to go to prison, which was like July 5th, he convinced those guys that he was going to go to Ohio. He said, "Okay, I'll run," instead of going to prison. And they had called and gotten a reservation out of Hartford for him to fly instead of Boston. And Beamus was going to drive him to Hartford. And that's when it all started falling apart. And the very next day, we made the arrest of all the characters.
Were you there for the arrests of these guys, each one of them, or?
Nope, mine was Greg.
You got Greg, though. And
Greg lived in a 3-decker, which a friend of mine who recently passed away said, "Don't call it a triple-decker." Now, you read my book, and you're going to see it says triple-decker a lot. And other times it says 3-decker, because I didn't want
I
to
call them 3-deckers. Yeah.
I didn't want to use the same terminology the whole time. He
Yeah,
said, "Don't call it a triple-decker. That's a sandwich." So Greg lived in a 3-decker on the first floor. And about 7 a.m. in the morning, I was walking down the right-hand side as you're looking at it from the front. And I'm looking in each window. And when I got to the bedroom, the window was up with a screen because it's the middle of summer. And I could see Greg sleeping in bed. And I tapped on the window, on the frame. And I said, Greg, it's Wayne Miller. I got my gun pointed right at your head."
Did he know who you were at that point?
Yes, he had come in for a polygraph, and I had interviewed him.
Yeah.
So he flunked the polygraph also. But he thought we were just going to ask about one certain fire that he didn't do. But we asked the general questions. Do you know who's setting these fires? Did you plan with anyone to set fires? And he failed on those questions. So he knew who I was. Yeah. And I made the arrest of him that morning.
Yeah.
So, but it gets more interesting after that too.
Okay, go ahead.
They all pled not guilty. Some of them were going to roll over and plead guilty eventually. Grabowski was the only one still sticking to, he was going to testify. Joe Gorman was going to testify. But then they locked up, I don't know why, Beamus, Stackpole, and Wayne Sandin all in the same cell at Salem jail. No, was it in Salem? No, I think it was in Salem first. And it's a 100-year-old jail, and it's the middle of summer, and it's hot as hell. And all of them are in the same tiny cell for 2 weeks. Normally, you split people up so you can keep them separate, so they can't make up stories. But right. Stackpole started talking about murdering Grabowski and some other witnesses. So, and he had the means and people who could do it for him, apparently. So Beamus wanted out. Because of that, he jumped over to our side.
And so we started cooperating at that point, yeah.
He signed an agreement for 30 years in prison to cooperate, testify, and trial. And it was written on a napkin because the U.S. attorney who went there that day, Mark Robinson, was at the U.S. Attorney's office picnic. It was on a Saturday. He was at a picnic. He didn't have anything with him. So on a napkin, he signed the agreement, And Greg's been pissed ever since he signed that agreement. But eventually, when he pled guilty and testified in 2 trials, he got his sentence reduced down to just over 10 years.
10 years.
He testified brilliantly in 2 trials. Late 1984 was the first trial of Stackpole. Stackpole was just so mean and nasty, he wasn't going to take that. He wasn't going to roll over and plead guilty. So it was a 3-week trial. And Grabowski testified too, but he was not as good as Greg. But then the second trial was Norton, the Boston firefighter, who had a lot to lose. He had his pension and get kicked out of the job. And he was pretty mean too. And so he went to trial, and he finally got sentenced in March of 84. He got a 4 to 6 year sentence. He did not set any fires. He only conspired, let them use his house to have meetings and even make the devices his house. So, but he didn't set any fires. So let's see. Grabowski got 12 years. Stackpole got the most. He had a 40-year sentence, and under the federal guidelines back then, he ended up doing about 23. And Wayne Sandin, who could have gotten out of this very light if he had told me the truth from the beginning, he ended up with a 23-year sentence and did about 17.
Wow.
Yeah. And the other guy's got something like 2 to 4 years.
I wonder if any of these guys are still sparks, if they're still going to any fires. I mean, you probably can never get that out of your system, your desire to want to be, especially someone, like Greg, who had that since was almost born into it.
Well, funny thing with Greg, he works for a fire equipment company today. And I was a member of Metro Fire Investigators, and we had a house west of Boston that we were going to set some small fires in and then let it go completely once we investigated the small fires and put those out. And Greg was parked right across the street watching us. And this was after he got out of prison, So, but I do have this friendly professional relationship with Greg Beamus today. His birthday's coming up in about 12 days, and I'll probably take him out around his birthday. He still answers some questions for me. You came up with something that I didn't know about. I was going to bring up to him earlier. You said something. I said, I got to ask Greg that.
Yeah. Well, maybe he'll come on the show with me and answer some questions. Feel free to ask him. We'd love to have him on.
Well, we tried to have him on the Chronicle episode. The Boston WCVB Channel 5 has Chronicle. Yeah. And they did a full half hour on this story. Yeah. I asked Greg if he would participate, and he said, "No, it's a little too close to home. A lot of people, he has a different last name, and a lot of people know him by only his new last name. Some people know him by his old name, and some people know him by both." Yeah. He said it's a little too close to home. So he did answer an email, though, from the producers. And, this was 35 years after the fires. And Greg still takes some credit for getting the Traeger bill passed. The Traeger bill was signed by the governor to give money back to the cities and towns, and he still takes some credit for that.
There's one more thing I'd like to go into, because we forgot to go into this, but this is a big part of the book too, is the devices they used and the evolution of the ways that the device they used to actually set the fires. Or is that something we shouldn't go into to the public? I don't know.
Well, back in the 1980s, I wouldn't tell the public this, but today is a different era. Yeah. First of all, it was in court records in great detail. Plus, we had a video showing the device, how it worked in the courtroom. Then I describe it in my book in detail. So I am not, and with the internet today, I'm not leery about telling the general public.
Right.
You can find anything you want today.
Right.
So initially, they just Greg learned this anyway. He learned all about it in a fire investigation class. You just take a matchbook and you interlace a lit cigarette within the matches. The lit cigarette burns down, eventually lighting the matches. They use that on their dumpster fires. And it worked pretty well. But they graduated to something a little more, had a little more oomph to it by using a brown paper bag with a Ziploc baggie of Coleman lantern fuel. Or you could put possibly gasoline, but it might eat through the plastic bag. But the Coleman lantern fuel, then they put tissue. And when you place the device inside a building or against, the favorite type of building they had was these gas shingles, asphalt shingles, which in the 1940s, Boston built a lot of those on these 3-family buildings. And if you just place a match against it, a lighter, you could get these shingles to burn. But with this device, once you place it, you place your cigarette and your matchbook lit inside. Let that take off. Now think about it. We could not find any of the matchbook, the cigarette, the tissue, the Ziploc baggie, the fuel, or the brown paper bag. We didn't find
It all gets
any of that.
because it all gets consumed, right? So yeah,
If about 99% of it would be consumed, and then you got water and hoses, you got
yeah,
firefighting, you got building collapse, you get charred debris that looks almost exactly like maybe the filter on a cigarette would look, and stuff like that. So
yeah,
very, very difficult to find.
yeah.
They added tires to it. In Boston had vacant lots all over, and people would throw their used tires in
Yeah.
these lots. And you just place that device of theirs within that tire well and place that in the building or up against the side of the building and get that tire going. It really gets the building going.
Yeah, I'm curious about the effect. When I was reading about that in your book, what it reminded me of is where I grew up in Lawrence, Mass. We had right across the street from us was a small patch of woods, and there was a group of kids that were starting fires in that patch of woods pretty regularly. Because growing up, I used to always remember seeing the fire department out there, and especially when it burned it at night, you could see them out there with their hoses and everything is lit up from the flames. But when things really took off, and I don't know if they ever caught these kids and stopped them after this, was they rolled out some tires and used that. And I don't know how many they had, but we were watching them for a while. And I remember every, 5 minutes or a few minutes, one of those tires would go, it would spark. I don't know, like 20, 30, 40 feet into the air. I mean, it was very visible.
Yes, exactly. And imagine that up against the side of gas shingles on a building.
Yeah.
Gas shingles are a petroleum product too, and it'd be up to the roof line in a matter of minutes. And we did that with a tire at the Boston training facility, and we put it up against a concrete wall, and the wall started, and the term is spalling, spalling. It actually heats up the moisture inside concrete, which all the concrete has in the world, always has moisture content,
Yeah.
and it causes the water inside to boil, and it starts shooting shards of concrete at us. And we had to move back as we were videotaping the thing, and it just started shooting those sparks, not sparks, but actual fragments right at us.
And just from the tires. So, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then just one more question. So, Garrity Lumber. So that was actually not an abandoned building, right? That was an actual business that was still operating, right?
Yes. Once they got good press on their abandoned houses, but they got better press when they did June 3rd, 1982. They did Sparrow Toy Company, which was an active warehouse importing toys from China. And that building was 1,000 feet long by 300 feet wide. An ongoing enterprise. And Garrity Lumber, same. And now you're really introducing federal charges because these affect interstate commerce. And we could bring those charges in federal court. But they did a lot of commercial buildings. They even did tire companies. Back in that day, especially in the city, there's a lot of companies that had recaps and stuff. And they'd have their tires stored outside. They set them up against the building and burned a lot of businesses that way, small businesses that went out of business forever. Sparrow Toy moved out of the Massachusetts down to New Jersey. Garrity Lumber eventually moved out of Massachusetts completely.
Hey, everybody. This was Wayne Miller, retired ATF agent, and his book is Burn, Boston, Burn. I'll link to it below. You'll see I'll link right to the Amazon so you can buy it on there. I have the Kindle version. It's really, really good. He also has another book out that we hope to have him on in the future to talk about that. What's the name of the second book?
Bang, Boom, Burn. It's
Bang, Boom, Burn. Okay. All right.
21 short stories, including the 46 machine gun case, some undercover, 2 horrific bombing cases. One killed a Boston police officer, and the other one, if you can imagine, a 50-year-old guy dating a 30-year-old woman. She was American Indian. Her family disliked him a lot. So he sent 6 Christmas packages to her family. 4 of them exploded, killing 5 people. And then another 14 or so arson cases, and they're of all types. But also, could you direct them to burnbostonburn.com?
Yes.
Because if they want their book signed, and the only color pictures come from me through my website, I personally sign them and put them in the mail right from my house upstairs here. And
We'll link to both of them. Yeah, absolutely.
appreciate it.
And you also the Worcester cold. We have a lot of Massachusetts fans. You did the Worcester cold storage fire, which was another huge case that impacted a lot of people. I knew some of the people involved. So
Yes, I was there from the night it happened for the next 10 days. And the last chapter in Bang, Boom, Burn is through my eyes, what was going on in my head as I was there for the 10 days. It took 8 days to recover all the bodies of the 6 fallen firefighters. So
yeah,
a lot was going on.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Again, thank you very much, Wayne. It's been great, and we hope to have you back. We'd love to have you back.
Absolutely. I would love to come back. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Wayne.